Okay, this is English 101, week 12, part 11. I'm on paragraph 15, which is the middle paragraph on page 4 of Eric Fromm. So a person can only be free through acts of disobedience by learning to say no to power. But it is not only the capacity for disobedience, but not only is the capacity for disobedience the condition of freedom, freedom is also the condition for disobedience. It's complicated and it's interesting. The ability to disobey is the only way to be free. But you also have to be free enough to disobey. It's tricky. If you're not free, you can't disobey. But disobedience is also, if you can never disobey, then you're not free at all. If I am afraid of freedom, I cannot dare say no. I cannot have the courage to be disobedient. Indeed, freedom and the capacity for disobedience are inseparable. You have to be, in order to be free, you have to be able to say no sometimes. You can't feel like I have to say yes to everybody and also be free. Freedom means sometimes you go, no, I'm not going to do that thing that you, the boss, said to do. That's what freedom is. Hence, any social, political, and religious system which proclaims freedom yet stamps out disobedience cannot speak the truth. So when people say, well, disobedience is un-American, Colin Kaepernick's going to protest America, and people are like, that's un-American. No, that's freedom. If you can't protest, if you're not allowed to ever protest, all the guy did was take a knee during the national anthem because the cops are shooting black guys who didn't do anything and killing them, and he didn't want to stand up for the national anthem. He was free to, people didn't want him to do that, and he disobeyed those people and did it anyway. And that takes courage, that takes practice, that's a hard thing to do. And people go, America's all about freedom, but that guy's not allowed to do that. Like, if you're not ever allowed, when is he allowed to say no? I mean, he's doing something nonviolent. He's literally just taking a knee. He's not hurting anybody, he's not killing anybody. People go, he's not allowed to do that. Well, if you're not allowed to do that, you're not living in a free society. That's right, Colin Kaepernick was an athlete, he's a black athlete, was a black football player who, when you sing the national anthem, people are supposed to stand up and put your hand over your heart, and he didn't want to do that because he felt like America was kind of a fucked up place, and I kind of agree with him because cops were shooting a lot of unarmed black people like they do. And he didn't like it. And he did something non-violent, and people got so upset because he disobeyed. People told him not to do it, and he did it anyway. And that makes people lose their goddamned minds. And honestly, a lot of the freedom that has been achieved for black people in this country and for women in this country was done by being disobedient. Civil protests. You're protesting people. Civil rights protests. You say, I refuse to sit at the back of the bus. I refuse to drink out of this water fountain that's only for black people. Right? It's like that's the kind of disobedience that in Fromm says disobedience helps society evolve. Those are examples of that. Okay. And if you live in a society that doesn't ever allow you to disobey, that's not a free society. Sometimes you should be allowed to say no. And if you're never allowed to say no, you're not, oh, America's the land of the free. Is it? I feel like people often are not allowed to say no in America. Or the consequences of saying no are so overwhelming. You lose your job. All right. Cool. All right, so we're now in paragraph 16, which is heading towards the end here. He says, there is another reason why it is so difficult to dare to disobey, to say no to power. During most of human history, obedience has been identified with virtue and disobedience with sin. It's true. People have been told that for huge swaths of human life and for huge parts of people's lives, people say, oh, it is good to obey. It's a virtue. Like a moral virtue to obey, and you disobeyed me. It's immoral. You're going to hell. The reason is simple. Thus far, throughout most of history, a minority has ruled over the majority, meaning rich people. Rich people have been ruling over huge numbers of people, the king or whatever. He says, this rule was necessary by the fact that there was only enough of the good things of life for the few, and only the crumbs remained for the many, right? So the rich people just hoarded all the wealth and barely gave anybody else anything. If the few wanted to enjoy the good things, and beyond that, to have the many serve them and work for them, one condition was necessary. They had to learn obedience. So if a very small number of rich people were going to stay in charge of a very large number of poor people, then they needed to tell those people, hey, y'all need to obey all the time. It's good. You go to heaven if you obey. So there are Christian beliefs that you should always obey authority. Well, it's interesting. Like, why would you? Like, for example, a lot of this is controversial, but a lot of Americans kidnapped people from the continent of Africa and brought them here to be slaves. Then they gave them Christianity. Well, a lot of Christianity is about obeying authority. And so it's interesting that this book that's like, you obey authority, God will judge, it's a good way to get people to keep working for you. And they'll feel like, well, God will sort it out later. I guess I'll just obey for now. And there are other versions of Christianity. Certainly Christ disobeys a lot. He gets killed for it. So it's more complicated than that. But a lot of people feel like part of the Christianity that took hold in this country was done so because it told people to obey people in authority. You know, I shouldn't have brought this up because Christianity is so complicated. There are versions of Christianity that emphasize Jesus's disobedience and his radical disobedience of the Roman authorities, which is why he was crucified. But there's other sections of Christianity that like to emphasize the fact that you should obey earthly authorities because your real home is in heaven. So there's two different kinds of Christianity in this case. To be sure, obedience can only be established by sheer force. But this method has many disadvantages. I mean, you can get people to obey by just putting a gun to their head, but how are you going to keep a gun to their head all the time? It constitutes a constant threat that one day the many might have the means to overthrow the few by force. Furthermore, there are many kinds of work which cannot be done properly if nothing but fear is behind the obedience. Hence, the obedience which is only rooted in fear of force must be transformed into one rooted in man's heart. So, like, you can make people obey by putting a gun to their head, but that's hard to do all the time for everything. So what you got to do is kind of brainwash people a little bit so that instead of putting a gun to their head, they sort of want to obey. They're like, oh, maybe I should obey. That's like the best way to get obedience because there are not enough guns to put to people's heads. Hence, the obedience which is only rooted in fear of force must be transformed into one rooted in man's heart. That's the brainwashing I was talking about earlier. Man must want and even need to obey instead of only fearing to disobey. So it's not enough that it's like, oh shit, if I disobey, I'm going to get shot. You have to convince a bunch of people that obeying is a good idea. I'm a good person if I do what the king says. I'm a good person if I do what the president says. Anybody who disagrees with the president is a traitor. Like, right? That kind of thing. You need people to think like that if you got a small number of people at the top who are controlling a large number of people at the bottom. If you've ever seen the movie Ants, there's a great scene in Ants where at the end of the movie when it's a cute movie, but basically it's about a very small number of grasshoppers trying to control a very large number of ants. They do it by scaring them. But at the end of the movie, the ants realize, hey, wait a minute, we actually outnumber you. Because that's always the problem in society, is that the people not in charge outnumber the people in charge. So the only way to keep all the people not in charge in line is you can't just put a gun to their head and say you have to obey me, because that's not going to work for a huge number of people. You got to make them want to obey you. And that involves a little bit of brainwashing. I'm calling it brainwashing, by the way, but Fromm says it's the internalization of authority. It's you raise a kid and you get your voice in their head and they start to think the way you want them to think. And then it's hard to unlearn that. And if anybody does, you get mad at them until they stop. Okay. If this is to be achieved, power must assume the qualities of the all-good and the all-wise. It must become all-knowing. If this happens, power can proclaim that disobedience is sin and obedience a virtue. And once this has been proclaimed, the many can accept obedience because it is good and detest disobedience because it is bad, rather than to detest themselves for being cowards. It's a really interesting sentence. But he says that you got to convince people that obeying is good and disobeying is bad. Because otherwise, just disobedience is bad. Because the truth is, disobedience is hard and it requires bravery, and sometimes it's good. And you don't want people to think about that. Okay, cool. From Luther to the 19th century was one concerned with overt and explicit authorities. Luther, the Pope, the princes wanted to uphold it, the middle class, the workers, the philosophers. Okay, I'm going to pick up this example in the next video, the final video of today. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next and final video of week 12.